Okay, so up until this point in the tutorial, we've covered everything that we need to do in order to manage a customer subscription from our end, meaning within our application. But the thing that we haven't really discussed yet is how do we handle events that come from the other direction, so meaning they come from Stripe back to our application. And so the way that we're going to do this is working with something called webhooks. So webhooks are a convention for sending messages from a third-party service to an application. So in this case, Stripe will create a webhook and send it to us, and it's our job to handle that in our application. And so we're going to go through the process of how we're going to handle that and how that impacts our work. But to get started, I wanted to point out this tool called ngrok, which makes it a heck of a lot easier for testing webhooks. And the big thing, and we'll see this in a little bit with testing webhooks, is that we need to be able to handle inbound HTTP requests from a third party, in this case Stripe. And generally that means you have one of two options. You can either deploy your application to a remote server and wait, or you can use a service like ngrok to create a tunnel. And a tunnel is just a way to create some sort of URL that's public facing, but ultimately points back to your local machine. And so we can see here, secure tunnels to localhost. This is exactly what we want because Stripe is going to need a URL to send webhooks to, and we can't just send them to localhost. We can't send them to localhost 3000 directly because literally anybody developing a Meteor application or any application running on port 3000 would need to be able to interpret that. So we have to give them a remote URL that they can actually send webhooks to. But in order to test locally, we need a way to define a tunnel from that remote URL to our local host so that we can test locally without having to deploy as we build out our webhook system. So ngrok is a system I recommend for this. We're not really going to go through the process of installing this, but I wanted to point it out. So if you jump over to the downloads page, it has a little installer that you can download for your system, and a bunch of stuff is supported, so you should be in here somewhere. Once you've downloaded it, it's just a command line utility. So you start ngrok by calling /ngrok. So this is relative to wherever you've unzipped the ngrok download that they give you. And you can just say /ngrok and then help to get information about how to start it. But they tell you how to start the ports up and all of that stuff and configure it. It's pretty simplistic, but this is something you're going to want before you move forward because handling webhooks otherwise is a pain in the butt because you're constantly deploying changes to the code that's going to handle webhooks, and that's just a mess. So once you have this set up, what we need to do is jump back into our application source. And so up until this point, and here we're back in our subscription component that we just finished up, we've handled all of the events that we can fire manually on behalf of the customer. So they click something and we call an event doing something on Stripe. We've handled everything that we can handle on our end, but now we need something that we can test a webhook against. And so the easiest thing for us that will also benefit our customers is by displaying invoices. So invoices are literally invoices that we receive from Stripe when some sort of payment event occurs on their end. So if a customer subscription renews at the end of the month, we'll get back an invoice from Stripe via webhook, and then we can choose to either send that along to the customer or store it in our database or something like that. And so we're going to store it in our database. We're going to create a collection and actually store these invoices. So as Stripe sends us webhooks, we'll be able to record those invoices for each user, and then the user will see them in their dashboard. So we've added this component invoices here, and if we go back into our application, we can see we've got it rendered here on the page. Real quick, let's go ahead and take a peek at that. So invoices, and again, we've defined a collection, so let's pull that up. And our collection is very simple. It's following the exact same pattern as we saw earlier for our customers collection. Same idea. We define a new MongoDB collection. We lock down our allow and deny roles, and then we set up a schema. And in this case, we've mapped this as close as possible to the actual data that Stripe's sending us. So we're not tweaking the language here, tweaking the names of the properties that are on the object. We're literally calling it exactly what Stripe gives us. And the point of this is just to make our work a little easier, because as we're receiving messages, we want our data to map as close as possible to what Stripe sends us. Otherwise, it turns into kind of a nightmare, and you can waste a lot of time trying to figure out, okay, what did I call this versus what does Stripe call? It's not fun. So here we're literally using, and you'll notice, normally we define things with camel case, but Stripe uses this underscore syntax. So we're following that to a T just to make sure that everything we get from them maps almost perfectly back to our own database. So we've got our collection, and then once we've got our schema defined, we go ahead and attach it, and then do a default export on that. Again, this is just like our customers collection that we defined earlier in the tutorial. So if you're confused, make sure to go back and review those, and that should help you out. So let's go ahead and close this up, and then back in our invoices component. So earlier we looked at the usage of renaming a component when we import it into another file, which we're doing here. So we're just importing the invoices component as invoices here, but in the actual component definition file, we're calling it invoices list, because otherwise we'd have a namespace collision with the invoices collection that we just defined. So we leave invoices as is, and we change the name to invoices list in this file. But because we're doing a default export down here, when we import it, it doesn't matter what we call it. So just to make that clear, back here we're trying to import the invoices component, but we could just as easily call this pizza, and then down here at the bottom of our component we could change this to pizza, and it would literally render whatever code we're rendering in here. So it's not really changing the actual name of the component, it's just changing how we reference it in a given file. So at this point we're importing this as invoices here, but in this file it's actually defined as invoices list, and then we use default export. Cool. So what's going on in this component? So you'll notice that we've got a React Composer container wrapping our component, so invoices list, and invoices list here is literally pointing to this definition here. And what we're doing is we're subscribing to a new publication that we haven't set up yet on the server called customer.invoices. And like you might expect, this is just going to return a list of invoices for our current customer. By current customer, we mean the user that's logged in. So if we jump up to the server and look at our publications, and for this we're in imports API customers server publications, we've added one more, and it's real simple, customer.invoices, and all it's doing is returning a single MongoDB cursor to invoices.find, and then we want to find all of the invoices where user ID maps to this.user ID. And if you've never seen this before, automatically Meteor provides us with this.user ID inside of our publications, just like it does in our methods. So you can reference this here, and it will always refer to whoever the currently logged in user is. So you don't have to figure that out in any way. It's already done for you, which is pretty neat. So all this is going to do is just send back down any invoices we can find matching that user ID. Pretty easy. So back in our component, what we're doing is saying, okay, once that subscription is ready and we've got some data, go ahead and fetch those invoices as an array and pass those, or that array I should say, as a prop down to our invoices list component. And so back up here we can see, if we pull the whole thing in scope, we have invoices the prop, and then all we're doing is mapping over that list of invoices. And you'll notice we're using a little bit of ES 2015 destructuring to say, okay, we just need to pluck off these values from each invoice to display on screen. And of course, you can do whatever you want. We're actually storing a lot more data than this, but for the sake of simplicity in this tutorial, we've limited this to just show you that, okay, we can get data into the database. But if you want to render a PDF, or if you want to have a separate page where users can view an invoice or anything like that, you're going to need to do that on your own. But the good news is you already have the data in the database. At this step, we're simply just using the most basic of information to say, okay, display some invoice so the user can see that it exists. And we should point this out. Again, we're referring to this epic to human conversion method that we set up earlier. So we didn't really dig into this. We just left a note and pointed you to the module in GitHub, but we can look at it real quick now. So in imports modules dates.js, we have this single method which converts the epic timestamp. And an epic timestamp is a set of either 10 to 13 numbers that references a date since January 1st, 1970. And that's how Stripe sends us all of their dates. So we have this module to convert those dates into a more human-readable format. Or this is, we display the full name of the month, the day, and then the full year. So that's all that's happening in here. And the reason we're not doing a default export is because you may have a situation where you want to have other date conversions, or you have different versions of this. So you can export multiple date functions from here and import them into the file where you need them. And so in this case, we've got epic to human, and we're using that to convert the date of the invoice. And then we have cents to dollars. And cents to dollars we saw way back in the tutorial. And again, all this is doing is just taking a number in cents and converting it to a US dollar amount. It's doing it as a string, so that way we can see what the actual dollar amount is as opposed to just a number of cents. That can get kind of confusing. Nobody wants to say, why am I paying $500 for a subscription when we actually mean $5? So that's what that's for. Okay, so with this in place, we've got a component for listing our invoices, and we saw that we have a collection set up, but now what we need to do is actually go through the process of handling webhooks. And so when we talk about handling webhooks, what we need to do is define a server-side route that we can point Stripe to. We'll go into the details of doing that pointing and all of that stuff, but what we need to know is that we need an endpoint that we can point Stripe to. And an endpoint literally means a route that's only exposed on the server side of our application. What we mean by that is, instead of on the client side where we might respond to a URL typed into our application with a rendered React component, when it comes to server-side routes, all we're doing is responding to a request in some way. So traditionally speaking, a web application is always using a server-side route. A server-side route is just a way to respond to an HTTP request. The difference between a traditional application, so maybe something built with Rails or PHP versus Meteor, is that Meteor doesn't do any server-side rendering of pages. So in a typical Rails application, without any of the fancy stuff, we might make a request as a user to the meteorchef.com. We'll say, just for the sake of example, that the meteorchef.com is a Rails app. Make a request to the meteorchef.com, and what's happening behind the scenes is we hit a server-side route, and that route is responsible for finding the matching HTML, JavaScript, and all of the front-end stuff, as well as the data, and then building that into a page, and then that is sent back. So the resolution of the HTTP request is quite literally that built page with all of the data, everything pre-rendered, back to the client. And so the difference between that and Meteor is that when you connect to a Meteor application as a user, so now we'll use the real example, so the meteorchef.com is a Meteor application. What's happening is you make a request to the meteorchef.com, and Meteor is bundling up all of the client-side code that you need to render the application and sending that down. So this is why you'll notice in Meteor applications, we see the interface pretty quickly, but we may not have the data yet. And that's because Meteor has a concept of data on the wire. And by that, what we mean is we send our front-end code down first, and then all of our data changes come across the wire in real time. So as our database changes, those data changes are synced to the client over the wire. And that's why it looks so quick when you're working with the Meteor application, is because we already have all the code we need to render a view on the client. We're not waiting for a server to respond. And so we're able to quite literally render the view, and then once we get the data, render the data. So that's why you see spinners a lot in Meteor applications and things like that, is because we're rendering the UI, but we're waiting for the data to come in behind it. And so we have to have some sort of loading or waiting period until that data is available. And generally that's only a few seconds, but that's the basic concept that's at work. And so how that ties into all of this is that we're defining a server-side route here for handling our webhook. And that just means something that will ingest an object that we're getting from Stripe and then doing something with it. And this is very simplistic. There's not a lot of activity going on here. We're not doing a whole lot of stuff. We're simply just saying, okay, when we get a request from Stripe to this endpoint, so you'll see here we're using a parameter that says service. So this is just making this a little more flexible in the event that you need to handle webhooks for multiple services. If not, it's nice to have, so you have it. But the thing to know is that we're going to ultimately pass a URL back to our application that points to /webhooks/stripe in this case. So service is a variable. We'll just be pointing to webhooks/stripe to say we only want to work with Stripe webhooks. And so when we get a request from Stripe, meaning they send us a message to this URL, this specific URL, webhooks/stripe, we're going to take in that request and we're going to grab the body of it. And then what we're going to do is look at the params. So params are referring to anything like this. This is a param or an argument. Name is interchangeable. We can call it a variable if you'd like. And what we're going to do is say, okay, we want to handle that webhook, and we're going to look on an object that we're importing up here called handle webhook. And so that handle webhook object that we're importing has all of the different services that we want to support. So right now we just have Stripe. That's the only thing we're supporting in this tutorial, but you may have something else. So maybe there's a MailChimp webhook that you want to handle. You would define MailChimp here, and then you'll notice that we're importing another module. So webhooks as Stripe, we're pulling that from our master stripe/index.js file. So that's the same one that we've been pulling all of the methods from to interact with Stripe earlier in this tutorial. But what we're doing here is we're going to store our webhooks there as well. And I just added this in. The reason I did that is to make sure that it's clear that technically this is assumed that we're pointing at an index.js file. We don't need to say it. But if it'll help you understand it a little better, you can specify /index.js. But automatically this import is going to assume if we're pointing at a directory just flat like this, we're expecting it to be pointing to an index.js file. So if we go into our index.js file, we can see that we have this object called webhooks that we've added to the top. And what this is doing is it's saying, okay, for each of the different types of webhooks that we need to handle from Stripe, we have the exact name of it as it will be sent to us from Stripe. So we'll look at this in a second, but just know that Stripe is going to send us webhooks, and each and every webhook is going to have a name associated with it, some unique name that identifies what type of event this is. And so in this case, for each event type, we're going to call some sort of method. So we're not going to dig into this just yet. Let's go back a little bit and see how the rest of this is handled, and then we'll revisit this and see how all of these modules up here come into play. So back in here, we're going to delete all this stuff real quick, make sure we don't break anything. Looks good. Okay, and so what we're saying when we import that, just to make sure this is clear, Stripe is being pulled in, that object is being pulled in, and by object we mean right here webhooks, and then we're calling to the specific type. So type is that unique name that we're talking about in that object. So that's going to be the handler. And then if you notice, we're pointing to a function for each of these. So each one we're going to invoke as a function, and then we'll pass some data to it. So just hold that in mind. That's just for later. So back here in our actual server-side route definition, if we didn't mention it, we're using a library called Picker. This is an Atmosphere package, and there's a tutorial on the Meteor Chef all about it and how it works. So you can dig into that if it's a little bit confusing. But it's a package called Meteor Hacks Picker from Atmosphere. And what we're doing up here is saying, okay, Picker needs a way to parse the data that's sent to us. And so in every HTTP request, we can have a body that's attached to it. But that body may be in plain text, it may be in some other format. So we need to parse that before we actually handle a request. So in this case, we're saying we want the body parsed as JSON data, meaning it's just going to be a regular JSON object that we can interact with in our JavaScript. So that's what's happening here. And then as soon as we've defined that, we can define our routes. And so literally any route we define now will have its body parsed as JSON and added back on. So if we look down here, we can see that we're plucking off using destructuring body from request. So request.body is literally the object that's parsed for us by this middleware here. So middleware literally means it sits in the middle of our request and our route and converts the body to JSON data. So that's what's going on there. And so once we have that body, we find the service that we're trying to call. And again, this is in here, we're calling this service Stripe based on the service param here. So if we pass webhooks/stripe, we'd call to Stripe, and like we saw before, we had MailChimp on there, so this could be Webhook / MailChimp, and same exact thing would happen. We'd be returning that function, so this function here, in the object. So hopefully that makes sense. And so what we're doing, once we have the service, we're passing in the type value from Stripe that's on the body. So we've parsed off this body object, and now we're looking at the type first, and then passing the entire body second to our service. So in this case, we have type here, and then data is literally the data sent to us in its entirety from Stripe. So we have the type of webhook that we're trying to handle, and then all of the data altogether. And so again, we were talking about this unique type. This is literally the value that Stripe sends us, pointing to one of these names. So we have customer.subscription.deleted is a type of event that we can get from Stripe. And so if we go backwards, we're seeing, oh, okay, we're plucking off the function to call based on the type that Stripe passes to us. And so if that's defined, and the reason we do this if check is that there are tons of different events from Stripe. So if we go over here into the API reference, we see types of events. There are literally probably somewhere in the range of 25 to 50. I didn't count the exact number, but there are a bunch of different events you can handle. And the good news is that you don't necessarily need to handle all of these. That's up to you. It's very open-ended. So there are some, and the ones that we've covered are probably the best ones to cover, but you can literally cover all of these if you want. So if we see here, we'll just stop at a random one. So we've got review.opened. If we wanted to handle review.opened, we would add another line to this that said review.opened, and then we point to some function to handle when a review was opened. Simple as that. So you can support as many webhooks as you want or as few as you want. So in this case, we've just got 3 as an example, but you can do however many you want. And so if on this object that we're exporting here, webhook, so if on this object we can find a matching type, so a matching webhook type, we want to go ahead and call that function, whatever it is, passing in the data that we receive from Stripe. So again, data here is referring to the entirety of the body that we received from the request. And so once we have that, we can actually get to work in handling that webhook and doing something in our application. And down here, what we're doing is just creating a happy path. So as soon as we're at this point, what this means is we've received the request from Stripe, and we need to tell Stripe about that. Otherwise, Stripe won't know what to do. So we need to say 200, and this is a success code for an HTTP request. So we're going to say write head 200, which says, okay, the success code is 200, meaning everything's okay. And then we also end the response with webhook received. So really, there's nothing that Stripe can do if our own code fails, so that's why we're automatically just returning success. As long as we get the data, we don't really care about anything else. So we just send back to Stripe like, hey, thanks, we've got the data, we'll take care of the rest from here. So that's what's happening here. And so now let's dig into this a little bit. So we're going to look at this service function. And again, we plucked this off of handle webhook. So Stripe is our service, and we're trying to handle some type of event here. And so back up here, we call the service, pass all of this in, take in the type and data. We grab the appropriate function to call from this object. So we're importing this here instead of webhooks as Stripe. And then we're saying, okay, go ahead and get that specific event handler. And then we're calling that event handler. And so in our case, what we were looking at back on the client is when an invoice payment succeeds. So we're looking for the invoice.paymentSucceeded event from Stripe. And when we get that, we're going to call this module invoice payment succeeded. And so that's literally going to manage the process of creating a new invoice in our database for us. So let's go ahead and crack that open. And if we look in our module server directory, we've created an entire directory specific to our Stripe related code. And we've even branched off our webhooks code. So you can see here, we've got Stripe webhooks, and webhooks, each file is named identical to the name of the webhook. So this should make it very easy for you to understand how this is working. And if you want to add more later, we're just adding one file at a time for each unique webhook that we get from Stripe. So we're just creating a module to handle that code. And so if we look at invoice.paymentSucceeded, what's going on in here is that we're starting to parse the data that we get from Stripe in relation to an invoice.paymentSucceeded event. And so that's got a lot of different steps involved. We're gonna kind of move through this quickly, but all of this code is on GitHub. We're not going to look at these other two webhooks because they're also extra code, so we don't want to go too crazy here. But all of this stuff is written and working and up on GitHub. And the link is down below, so go ahead and check that out. But right now we want to focus on invoice payment succeeded. And what we're going to do is kind of step through this quickly. So when this function gets called, invoice payment succeeded, this method is what's being exported by default from this module. And so we take in whatever data we get from Stripe, and on that we have webhook.data.object.object. Now this isn't us. We haven't created this kind of snarl of nested objects. This is coming from Stripe. So what we're doing here is making sure that we can handle the different types of requests that we get from Stripe. And you'll notice here we have a little note. This value is either going to equal, meaning webhook.data.object.object. So what this final .object returns is either going to be a string that reads invoice or charge. And so Stripe will send us invoices based on different types of interactions from our customers. So in most cases we should just receive invoices, but this is also handling direct charges to customers. So if you expand this code later, this will also handle those types of invoices. We don't really need it for this tutorial, but nice guy Meteor Chef is hooking you up with that, so you don't have to worry about it. So what we're doing is figuring out what type of invoice we're handling, and then we're also grabbing the data. So just like we saw with the request body, we're figuring out the type, but then we're also grabbing the entire object. So the type is defined on this entire object, but we're grabbing them independently so they're a little easier to work with. The next thing that we're doing is grabbing the customer ID from the invoice data. So this is literally the invoice data that Stripe has sent us, and customer here is referring to the customer ID on Stripe. So this is how we start to connect what Stripe sends us back to a customer in our own database. And we can see that happening here on line 79 by saying, okay, take in that customer ID, so we store it behind this variable customer ID, and find a user matching in the customer's collection with this customer ID. So at this point, this is how we've made the connection between some random data that Stripe has sent us and data in our own database. Cool stuff. So if we get a customer back, what we want to do is try and find a user matching that customer.user ID. So this customer is going to return a customer from the database, and remember that for each customer object that we store, we also store the user ID of the user that belongs to that customer data. So we're getting that back and we're defining it here, and we're trying to find a user matching that customer user ID value. So once we have that user, we actually get to work in managing that invoice. And so here we check. So we say, based on the invoice type that we plucked off up here, if it's a regular invoice, we want to build the invoice. So this is a method defined up top that we'll look at next. And then we handle a charge as well. So if the invoice type is charge, we build an invoice from charge. And the reason we do these as separate methods is they have slightly different data, just enough to drive you crazy. So we've developed multiple methods for handling this, but you don't have to worry about it. They're both handled here. Just follow the code and it'll start to make sense as you move forward. And then finally what we're doing here at the bottom, this is kind of skipping ahead, we're saying if we have an invoice, so you'll notice up here we're using a let to scope this invoice variable to this entire try block. And the reason we do that is based on the different type, we're going to need to assign a different invoice value. So by setting a let invoice up here, we're able to reassign invoice based on the different type that we receive. So here we're doing that, and if invoice is defined, meaning we get back an object, we go ahead and insert that invoice into the invoices collection that we defined a little earlier in this video. So real quick, let's look at build invoice and build invoice from charge. And so build invoice is pretty simple. We take in the customer data that we had as well as the actual invoice data from Stripe, and then we just combine that into a single object and return it. That's literally it. And you'll notice we have this parse lines function here. This is because Stripe's invoices will have line items on them, and we need to parse those individually. And so parse lines is responsible for returning us back lines that match our database schema. So here we take in lines data, and we're parsing over that. So if we look real quick at parse lines, we can see, okay, for each line we map over it, and then we return a better formatted object for that line. That's all that's going on there. And so that is a regular invoice, but then we also have to handle if we're building an invoice from a charge. And so that's what's going on here. Same exact concept, just a little bit different. You'll notice that with lines, we don't really have lines returned to us. We just have a single item. And so what we're doing is just automatically setting this. We're not parsing lines at this point. We're just faking it. So we know that we're going to expect lines to be an array of objects, so we create an object ourselves inside of an array to return what would be a line item if we parsed it, but because Stripe isn't sending it to us with the charge type, we don't have access to that, so we have to create it ourselves. So that's what's happening here. And then they're both eventually relying on this description term. Is that true? I'm lying to you. They're not both doing that. Just this one up here. So when we parse lines, we rely on get description to get the description of the invoice item. Now, this is unique because you may say, like, well, why do we need to do that? Why can't we just point directly to description? The reason this code exists is because Stripe will store descriptions in different places. So it may be added to metadata.description, which is somewhere where we can store the description, or it may just be on the description field. So what we're doing in this method is we're literally saying, okay, let's figure out where the description is, if it exists at all, and then return that value, whatever it is. So if it's defined on metadata.description, we'll return that. If it's just defined on the description field of what we're passing over from Stripe, so the request from Stripe, we'll grab that. And then down here, we do one final check to make sure has description is defined, and if it's not, we just default to this string no description. So if you want this to say something else, you can customize it, but that's what's happening there. So that's, again, triggered by parse line. So as we parse line items, each line item may have a description. So if it does, we try and get it, and if not, we just return no description for that specific line item. And so that's it. That is literally handling a webhook from start to finish from Stripe. So if we kind of rewind and do this all in reverse, we can see that we handle our invoice in here, we parse all the data and get it into our database, but then we go back up. Let's close these out. So we're calling this module from within our Stripe index.js file. So we've defined a list of webhooks that we support, and when we get one of this type, invoice payment succeeded, we're calling that function and passing along whatever data we get from Stripe. So here we've called it webhook, but this is just the data from Stripe. We just pass that along. And whenever we invoke a function like this, so instead of calling it directly here, if we just call it like this, whatever arguments are passed will automatically be carried along to this function here. We didn't mention this, but you'll notice we're wrapping this in a Meteor bind environment because we're interacting with the database here. But because this is so nested, we need to make sure that, like we saw earlier, all of our functions are wrapped in a bind environment so Meteor is scoped properly to the current running process. Without this, we would get a bunch of errors about Meteor processes need to run in the current fiber or something like that. So pay attention and keep an eye out for things like this because they're very, very important to make sure your code runs correctly. So this is the function we're calling based on this event. We call that event. So how do we get to here? Well, back in handle webhook, we're importing that list of webhooks that we can call, and we're taking in a type from the original request from Stripe and saying, okay, give us back that specific function to call. We call it, passing in the data, and then the way we get to here is back in our index.js file. So I don't think we pointed this out, but we're defining our API endpoint in imports API public and then index.js. We've just done this because this is a public API at this point that anybody can access, so we've just done it that way. And then back here in this file, we're ultimately calling the service here, so Stripe, that matches the service param here from the URL. And again, we're gonna look at that before we wrap up here, but we're going to point to webhook/Stripe to receive those requests. Okay, so last part of this is that we actually need to set this up on Stripe and see if we can receive a request. So we're going to make use of ngrok. You can see down here, I'm already running ngrok, and it's generated this unique URL for me. So this is what's cool about this service. And I say service, but this is entirely free. So once you install this, this will automatically work from free, and you can pay to get custom domains and stuff, but you don't have to. So we've got this URL here dynamically generated, and you can see down in my logs, I've already received a few webhooks to test this out, but we can see a hint that we're going to get something from Stripe. So now that we have our code set up, what we want to do in Stripe, or specifically in the Stripe dashboard, so make sure that you're logged into your Stripe account that you set up earlier for this. We want to select the Webhooks link from the left-hand side of the navigation. And when you first do that, what you're going to see is this page, which is just the list of all events that Stripe has recorded in relation to our Stripe account. So this is across all customers, across any activity that's happening. Stripe is going to log an event here. So we don't want this page, but what we do want is settings. So again, we're under Webhooks, settings, and you can see up here we've got the full URL, so dashboard.stripe/account webhooks. And what we need to do is add a new endpoint where we intend to receive webhooks. So you can see I've already set this up here, and I've set this equivalent to the ngrok tunnel that I've already defined. So I've started ngrok, and this is pointing back to our running application, but what you're going to need to do is grab your version of this URL. So ngrok will generate your own. And back here in the Stripe dashboard, we want to create a new endpoint using that ngrok address. So if we click Add Endpoint here, I'll just paste mine in so this is clear. You're going to take the ngrok address that you had, and you're going to point it to /webhooks/Stripe. And remember, back in our code, /webhooks/service, if we pass Stripe, so /webhooks/Stripe, that's going to point to Stripe inside of our handle webhook module here. So on this object we're exporting, we'll have Stripe as an option, so service here comes in as a param, and so we point to that inside of handle webhook. So that's the connection being made there. So back over here, we want to make sure we have our ngrok tunnel. So this is almost like saying localhost 3000 /webhooks/Stripe, but we're going to use that ngrok tunnel to make sure we're pointing back to our actual machine. And once we have our URL set, we want to make sure that for now we're just going to put this in test mode. So this is going to send us all events that occur in Stripe when it's in test mode. And so be very careful about this, because you don't want to accidentally receive live events and start making changes to live customer data. It totally depends on your setup. Nothing we've covered here should cause any issues like that, but just in case, make sure that you've set mode to test here if you're testing locally, because otherwise you'll either not get what you expect or run the risk of messing up actual customer data. So double check this every single time, make sure you're on test. And you also have an option to either receive all events from Stripe or select events. Select events, you can do this if you're a little bit picky, but for our needs, we're just going to say send us everything, and we'll worry about it later. But if you want to be a little more performant, or you don't want a bunch of junk data hitting your server, you can just say select events and be done with it. So I'm going to hit cancel on this because I've already defined my personal endpoint, but make sure it looks something like this before you continue. Once you have that, you're ready to go. So back in our application here, I have an example user set up, Fraser Crane, and Fraser is currently on the Tiny 5 documents plan. And so a little bit ago, we hinted at this invoices component and us listing out this data, but now we need to actually see this data appear, and this is going to appear only from the webhook. So when we change the customer's plan, keep in mind, we're not recording an invoice or anything like that. That invoice is coming from a webhook that we receive from Stripe. And so right now, to kind of demonstrate this and show you how this is all working, we're going to try and change Fraser's plan to the $20 a month plan, so 20 documents or large plan. When we do that, because it's $15 more per month than the tiny plan, we should see a new invoice generated with the different cost recorded down here. We should at least see a new invoice. We may not see the change, and the reason we may not see the change, and we see this $0 amount, is because Fraser is still trialing. So because he's in that trial window, we may get a $0 invoice, but we should see some form of invoice come through here. So let's go ahead and change the plan. Okay, Fraser's on the 20 documents plan. And there's usually a slight delay in between getting a webhook and performing an action. So if it doesn't show up, that's either because there's just a delay from Stripe, or that specific event, which may be the case here, isn't actually generating an invoice. But you can always check. So if we go back to Webhook settings and go to Webhooks, we can load new events, and we can see, okay, upgraded from large to tiny, or excuse me, from tiny to large. And we're going to look through this data and see. So we did receive a webhook, but what did we receive? So this is always important to look at, because we want to know what type. So we received a customer subscription updated webhook, but we didn't receive an invoice webhook. It doesn't look like we're going to get one from this. It's okay. So we didn't get that webhook. Let's see if we can do something else. You know what we're going to do is create a brand new user, and then we'll see how this works. So we're going to say Niles Crane, so Fraser's brother. Let's do niles@crane.com. We'll go password. And we'll start Niles out on the $5 plan. So we'll type in a card here. And we'll go ahead and sign up a new account. Okay, so we've got our account, and now if we jump up here to manage subscription, we should see an invoice pop in. There's our first invoice. So again, this is coming from the webhook. That's because we put Niles on the 5 documents plan. And now let's see, this may just be because we're trialing a user. If that generates a second one, it may not. No, it doesn't look like it's going to. But the good news is we saw our webhook working, because we saw this new invoice come in real time for Niles. And it came on a slight delay, because you notice we had enough time to log in the user and switch to manage subscription before we saw any data coming in. So that's the basic process. And again, webhooks are totally dependent on you. So you can receive as many webhooks as you want and do whatever you want with them, but it's up to you back in your code here to actually handle those webhooks in some way. So again, we're handling everything from Stripe, but because we're doing this little handler thing here, remember, we've only defined support for these webhooks. And some of them do different things than others. So invoice payment succeeded, when we receive a new invoice, we expect that to create an invoice in the database, whereas we saw the customer subscription updated webhook sent to us, we received it, but if we go and look at that, even though we didn't really dig into this in detail, all that's really doing is setting the same data that we were going to set, or we did set, when our customer change their subscription. So if we go back into our handle change subscription module from earlier, we can see we're setting the same data. And so that may be a little bit confusing, but the reason this code here is using the exact same thing, or doing the exact same thing. So this is handle change subscription, and we want customer subscription update. The reason these two are the same is that in some cases, Stripe will just send us a random customer subscription updated. And sometimes that's in response to, like what we just saw, where we changed a plan, and sometimes that's in response to something else. Maybe we manually changed something in the Stripe dashboard, or something changed with the customer's plan. Maybe we changed some plan data on the dashboard, something like that. But something happened that would trigger that event independently. And so we want to support that, as well as when we do it inline. So like handle change subscription, even though we're doing it here manually inline, we also want to account for situations where it happens automatically. So again, customer subscription updated, same exact code, but we want to account for that. And so at this point, that's about it. We could see ngrok receiving a webhook, which is kind of neat. We can see our code working, and we started to get a better feel for how a webhook or an event from Stripe travels through our system and actually performs some action on our end. And so hopefully that's enough information for you to build out your own app. But if you have any questions, leave them down below in the comments, and be glad to help out.